Today we'll be using 2 beakers, a pipette bulb, 1 pipette, and water. Today we'll be learning how to use a pipette. When using a pipette, we have to take into account where the meniscus is. The meniscus is the curve in the upper surface of a liquid caused by surface tension of the walls of the container being used. So we use the lowest point of the meniscus to measure. First is George Farrington. We start by placing the pipette bulb on top of the pipette and squeezing to suction up the water into the pipette. Then we use a finger to plug the end so the water doesn't come out. And then we check where the meniscus is to find the initial amount. Once we find the initial, we empty some of the water into the empty beaker and measure what is left in the pipette to find the final amount. It is important when using a pipette to round to the nearest hundredth, even though it only measures in tenths. After looking at the meniscus and recording the final amount, you empty it into a separate container, not back into the same one you got it from, to prevent contamination. Next, record your data, subtract the initial from the final, and that's how you get the volume. Next is Daniel James. Using the same method, squeezing the pipette bulb on top of the pipette, measuring the initial volume in milliliters, and estimating to the nearest 100th, then repeating the steps to find the final volume, and subtract the initial from the final to find the amount you released in the empty beaker. Lastly, you empty it into a separate container to prevent contamination. These are his final results. Last is Ashley Zambetti. By following the same steps and precautions, I used the pipette bulb to suck the water into the pipette. I then measured the amount to the nearest 100th in milliliters and repeated to find my initial and final volumes. I then emptied the excess into a separate container to prevent contamination. I then subtracted them to find the volume I released into the empty beaker. Then, lastly, I recorded it, and this is my recordings.